So the taking quadrant. I could talk about this one all day. It's been so full of surprises and ahas and insights about what's actually going on there. It's just been completely fascinating to me, and I never would have guessed it from the outset. It's all come just from exploring it, playing it with it, teaching it to people. So I'm going to try to stick to my notes so that we can get through this in less than a day. The taking quadrant is the intersection that includes both receiving a gift and taking action. And it's the one, obviously, that deconflates that doing is always giving. It's also the one that is the most challenging for almost everybody. It's not a question of whether it's going to be challenging, it's just a question of how much, and that there's a huge range to that. Because it's on the receiving half of the dynamic, it carries all the vulnerability that receiving a gift of any kind carries, and so there's you have a comfort level with how much of a gift you are comfortable receiving. And because it's on the doing half of the dynamic, it also carries a certain vulnerability there. You have the certain risk of like, well, what if I do the wrong thing? So that makes the taking role vulnerable and challenging in a lot of ways. First of all, you have to acknowledge that there is in fact something that you want to do without covering that up by the giving role. You're taking action for your own pleasure. So there's the guilt and the self-doubt that come along with that. Plus, you may not even know how to do that. In the taking role, you discover your lust, which I'm defining as the impulse to do something sexual to another person. So that's going to show up. And on top of all that, you're doing all those things in the presence of your partner. So it can feel emotionally risky to let them see all of this in you. Then there's the image of taking as using, grabbing, stealing, just taking what you want and disregarding anybody else's limits. That's what gives the word taking a bad name. And then there's the image of taking as taking charge, having passion. That's what we're supposed to be able to do. So you mix all this together and you just this big, taking is just a big confusing mess. So let's talk about it. So in taking, you get to discover that if you want to touch someone, you don't need to be giving to them. What you do need is their permission. And furthermore, it's okay to do that, to touch someone. That can be a big revelation. It's the agreement that you make that creates the role of take and allow. It's what constitutes actually being in the taking role is that, number one, you are respecting the limits of your giver, your allower. And number two, you are putting your own pleasure first. So you're not disregarding them, you are receiving a gift from them. Big difference. The old image of taking, the sort of negative image, is that you use someone, you just use their body for your own means, and you're doing whatever you can get away with, and that the selfishness implied there can be absolutely terrifying. So it's one reason why it's hard to go into the taking experience. And sometimes it's also why it's hard to even say the word. So if you want to avoid the taking quadrant, the most time-honored way is, of course, to go into the giving quadrant, and then you're touching, but you're doing it for the right reason. And you also get credit for being skilled and technique-wise, or you get credit for being generous and a good lover, and you get to avoid your own vulnerability and confusion about the taking experience. What's also true is that whatever quadrant you feel like you're in, you assume your partner's in the opposite one. So what happens is that for many people, and this is particularly true for women, we've been enculturated to be passive in sex, and so because we feel passive, we assume that the man is just doing whatever he wants to do, which is actually rarely true. What actually happens is that for most men, actually finding the taking quadrant is extremely difficult. because there's the fear that you're going to be the perpetrator, or the fear that you're going to get it wrong, or you're going to do the wrong thing, or you're going to alienate your partner. So it's ironic perhaps that many women feel like their men are always in the taking role, but most men don't feel like they're there, and they really have trouble getting there. So playing with all these quadrants clears all that up, so you have a lot more freedom. And while we're here, let's talk about gender. What does gender have to do with the taking quadrant? The answer is nothing. This is not the so-called masculine one of the quadrants. Every human being needs access to all quadrants. What is true, usually, is that for women, it's often easier initially to find the taking quadrant. We seem to have a little more access to our skin sensation, mostly I think because of conditioning. So it's often easier to find the taking quadrant, but then it's often more difficult to really go into the lusty part of it. And very often women, if they're used to being in the done to half of the circle all the time, don't have much confidence in doing really anything at all. What's often true for men is that the taking quadrant becomes quite scary because, as I just said, it feels like it could be perpetration or alienating your partner, and nothing more terrifying than that. So for many men, it's extremely difficult. So let's talk about getting good at the taking role, the mining the treasures that are there for you. First of all, it's not something that you can fake. You can kind of get away maybe with faking giving, but you can't fake taking because it's something that arises out of you. Neither can you give it. It's not something you can do for someone else, because as soon as it's for someone else, it's no longer for you. In order to find and experience the taking quadrant, a couple things have to be present. I talked about this back in the lessons. That is that your hands have to be open to the inflow, to taking in. You have to take in information. You have to take in pleasure. If that's not happening with your hands, the taking quadrant will not happen. The other thing that you need is permission. So you need skills of consent to notice that you want something, to notice what it is, to ask for it, to wait for the answer, and to respect the answer. All those consent skills have to be in place before you really find the taking role. It's the agreement that creates the taking role. May I feel your hand and arm like we did in the lesson, or may I play with your hair, or may I climb around and roll around on you? You say yes, now we have the quadrant. So it's the agreement that creates the role. Without the agreement, there is no taking quadrant. So then how do you go about learning it? First is that you start small. You start with short segments of time, 3 minutes, 5 minutes maybe. You start with body areas that are not particularly erotically charged for you, and you start with relatively smaller body areas too, particularly if it's challenging for you. And you start by using your hands to do the feeling, because your hands have more nerve endings than anywhere else, and they engage a lot of your brain cells because of that. So it's much easier to start out finding it with your hands. And that's what the lessons are all about, of course. And as you do that, you develop consent skills. As I just mentioned, the ability to notice what you want, to ask for it, and so forth. And as you develop those consent skills, you begin to trust yourself that you are not going to alienate someone or do harm to someone. And with that trusting yourself comes a tremendous amount of freedom. Also, as you're doing that, you're developing your ability to continue noticing the state of your partner. So your hands will notice if they tense up, or if they're relaxed, or if they're breathing, or if they suddenly stop and hold their breath. You'll continue to notice that. So you're developing that as you play with it. And it becomes quite natural. And you're developing your emotional comfort with your own desire, with your own sensuality, with your own lust, and with your own arousal. And that can sometimes be the hardest part. So again, starting slow, starting small, find the dynamic and how it feels to actually take in with your hands. So then with that clarity and those skills, then you'll start to gradually expand as you like, and more of your body becomes a playground. More of their body becomes available to you, and more of your body comes into your play. And then you'll hit your edge of self-doubt and shame again. You'll get turned on to a more, and then you hit that level of shame. Then you get turned on more, and you'll hit that level of shame. So it's a lifelong journey. Something that helps in understanding this is the intensity factor. And that's this. When we're learning something new, we're creating new neural pathways in our brain, and it requires that we slow down and we put some attention to it so that we can create this new pathway. And that all goes along great until you increase the intensity, and then you're going to default back to your old pathway and do it the old way that you always did it before. And by intensity, I mean either emotional intensity, either so-called positive or so-called negative. You're excited, it looks really great, or you're scared, or sexual arousal, that kind of intensity where you start getting more turned on, or simply moving your body faster. When you move your body faster, you will automatically tend to go into your default mode of how you've always done it. So when you're exploring taking, it's kind of new and you're really having to be attentive to find it. And if you start moving fast, you start adding sex to it, and you start, your fear comes up, you're going to flip back into your default. So that's why it's really helpful to take it gradually. And it's fun all the way along anyway, so why wouldn't you? I've seen a lot of people who the taking kind of clicked for them, and they can take just fine if it's an arm or a leg, they're moving slowly, and then the situation gets sexier, and everything they've learned about taking flies out the window, and they're right back into getting the job done. So that's why you take it gradually, and that's what works best. For most couples, even couples who have been partners for a long time and sexual for a long time, I say start in the living room and start with your clothes on until you get it. So to recap all that, to learn taking, you start slow, you start small, you start with a short turn. You gain those skills of noticing that it's for you, and those consent skills, and those skills then sustain you as your interaction becomes more complex. If you jump right into sex trying to find the taking quadrant, it won't work. You'll just jump back to your default. There is an art to taking. The bare minimum of taking, of course, is that you respect your partner's limits. The art of it is that instead of just sort of going along because, oh, I guess I have to, and maybe I could sort of sneak over the edge a little bit, like you could do that, I don't recommend it. The art is that once they set their limit, you actively take responsibility to guard that limit. And that means that they don't have to. It also means it gives you a lot more freedom because now you trust yourself more, and that gives you freedom to express yourself more. And part of that is not just the verbal agreement at the beginning, but continuing to notice as you're going along. You're doing exactly what you want, and it's what they agreed is fine, but you note, your hands notice, oh, they've suddenly become tense, or they've stopped breathing. Then it's time for you to stop and check in. Are you sure you're okay? And give them the spaciousness for them to be able to check in, see if maybe it is a little too much for them. So that's the art of taking. You guard their limit, not just acquiesce to it. And that's what makes it a wonderful experience to surrender to you. So I've mentioned a couple of times that shame is going to show up. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Shame about pleasure and sexuality is endemic. You can't grow up in this culture without some degree of shame and confusion about that. First, there's shame about just the very experience of pleasure and the desire. And then there's the other shame that comes in, that idea that we're somehow supposed to know all this stuff and be able to take charge and do the right thing and know what the right thing is to do. So then that gets added to it. So then again, it gets mixed up into a big mess. And the degree of shame and confusion we feel about it, of course, is a huge range. It can be just a minor blip that doesn't show up very often, and it can be debilitating and paralyzing. And it can show up right there in that very first lesson where your hands learn to feel. And of course, or that one might be easy, and it can show up in the taking quadrant where, oh, it's okay to feel pleasure, but not with someone else's body. So it can show up anywhere. The short definition of shame that I'm using here is not that you feel that you did something wrong, but that you yourself are wrong. It's just wrong to be the way you are, or to feel the way you feel. And that's an irrational phenomenon. It's not something that you think, it's something that you feel. It's a body response. And the result of that is that you avoid whatever it is that's going to bring up that body response, that emotion. So you want to hide it away. You hide it away from your partner. You also hide it away from yourself. But the problem is we need this aspect of ourselves. We need our sensuality. We need our impulse to take action. We need our playfulness. We need our desire. And we need to stop working at sex. And it's the taking role that recovers all that in a very gentle and gradual way. And when you recover that part of yourself, it's a big relief. And it gives you a tremendous amount of freedom, lets your heart show up in your hands again, and also brings integrity and maturity to your eroticism. And it's a lot more fun. So the antidote to this kind of shame is exploring the taking quadrant a step at a time at your own pace, and that will widely vary by person to person. So let's talk about the erotic elements in the taking quadrant. There's a few things that are sort of general in that realm, and that is that it's the taking quadrant that lets you stop working and show up to the present moment, and that lets you bring your desires forward. Without the taking quadrant, whatever impulse you have to do or to touch or to reach for someone has to be funneled and framed in this only one way you're allowed to do that, which is giving, which means that you are always on task, you're always exerting some effort, you're perhaps seeking some validation from the person that you're trying to give to, and you are stuck on your goal of getting from here to there. And when you are stuck on a goal, your brain narrows its focus so that you are determined to get from here to there. And therefore, all this information and wonderful stuff that's happening right here, you can't even notice it because you're very focused. It's a narrow focus. So also in the erotic element, there's something about your hands that really changes in the taking quadrant. And that is because you are tending to what's coming in your hands instead of what you are trying to send out your hands relax, they show up, and they tend to be sort of softer and drape around the contours. You take in all the contours of your partner. They tend to wander, they're not predictable, they're not repetitive, and they become curious about your partner's entire body. The idea of, well, they have an erogenous zone here, and so therefore I have to do with it, that stuff flies out the window. It's just bunk. Your entire body is erogenous. So because your hands are taking in, their entire body becomes interesting and desirable to you instead of focusing on these parts that you think are supposed to do something. And so, of course, that opens up this wonderfully grand, big field to play in. So then your hands are becoming intuitive, very sensual, creative. There's a sense of presence in your hands. It's hard to describe, but it's definitely, you can feel it. And your hands invite trust, which invites surrender. It's extremely difficult to relax under a hand that is tense and on a mission. So all this is learned in the taking quadrant, not in the giving quadrant. And that quality of touch affects everything that you do erotically. So taking is where you get to bring your desires forward, where the sensuality develops, where your confidence develops, where you're being able to express yourself in a way that's real for you. It's also where the primal comes out and the passion comes out. So also of interest, talking about the erotic elements here, is that there's a huge range of moods that's available and shows up in the taking role. It can be comforting, nourishing, cozy, sensual, languorous. It can be this sort of trance-inducing, slow, blissful states. It can be very tender-hearted. It can be curious and playful and silly. And it can also be lusty and passionate and boisterous. And the wild animal in you gets to come out and play. And emotionally, also, any of those sort of moods can be affirming and comforting emotionally, and they can also be a little disconcerting emotionally. So you have this huge range of moods, and that's a good thing. So this particular dynamic, erotic dynamic between taking and allowing, I want to talk about that a little more. There's a lot of talk these days, particularly among books and programs for men, about the encouraging men to learn how to take charge and to ravish their beloved. What's missing, though, is how do you actually go about doing that? Particularly since you can't fake it or give it. What you do is you access it, and you have the consent skills so that you can express it freely. That's where it comes from. It doesn't come from some technique. Still, ravishing is the sort of quintessential taking dynamic. It's what romance novels are full of. And it's also a dynamic that's unique to lovers. It's not a dynamic that you have with your massage therapist. So if you don't know how to access it within yourself, or you don't have the consent skills, then the whole ravishing thing is just some big mystery. And again, this touches into gender. It's not that men need to learn to ravish women. It's that everyone needs access to the taking role. And everyone needs to be able to learn how to take charge in a way that's authentic and also, of course, respectful. That's what taking's all about. I do want to add one note for males about erections, and that is that it's desire that fuels your erection, not giving and not performing for someone else. So if erections are a problem for you, almost always it's the taking quadrant that's going to clear that up. You learn to relax in just being here, and then everything's easier. So to recap all that about the taking quadrant and erotic elements of it, it's the taking quadrant that lets you stop working and stop guessing, and lets you show up with all of yourself, including your desires, in all the different ways that shows up, in all the different ways it changes and develops over time. There's one more thing I want to say about the erotic element of the taking quadrant, and that is that if you play with it a while, you'll start to notice that quite naturally it invites the opportunity to play with power, which is often called dominance and submission. When you're in the taking role, you're in the dominant, or you're the one with the power. And as you play with that over time and develop your consent skills, and you become trustworthy to yourself, then you can really dive in and have some very deep and very fun experiences. But this is the basic dynamic where you can easily, if you want to, explore dominance and submission or power exchange. Very fun and very rich place to play. One thing that often surprises people is that it's the taking quadrant that lets you be a better giver. Because now that you are no longer afraid of taking, you don't have to use giving to avoid taking, nor do you have to use giving to try to get something back. So you can tell the difference, and now your giving can become very clean and very clear, and so the flow is more satisfying both to you and to your receiver. And the other thing, which we've already talked about, is the quality of your hands being able to notice and take in information, and that they relax and become intuitive, so that also makes you a better giver. And when your hands become intuitive, they're not stuck in technique, they're very present. What happens in your life when this quadrant is difficult or not easy to access? What taking is about is that inner mechanism of doing something for your enjoyment, and also that inner mechanism of respecting someone's limits. And if either of those is off, then taking is going to be hard to find. Mostly what's hard for people is the first part, the ability to do something just for the enjoyment of it. Granted, we are all selfish beings and have done things that are very manipulatively selfish. But what we're talking about here is a very real, tangible, sensory, heartfelt, physical experience. And that is what tends to be difficult. So when taking is hard, it's easy to be very passive. You're waiting for someone else to do something, and passivity always leads to resentment. That's where it's going to go, so you're going to be resentful. It can be hard to know what actually that you do want and take responsibility for it. It can also be hard to really know that it's okay for you to take up space in this world. So there's a certain kind of timidity that shows up when taking is hard. When taking is hard, the only way that you can let yourself do anything at all is to frame it or make it about somebody else. But that's not actually giving, it's just avoiding taking. If taking is hard, you're going to tend to get stuck in giving, which means that you're always on task, you're always on effort, you're depending on technique, and you can't really quite show up and bring your desires with you. Not much fun. And if taking is hard, it's often difficult to have self-care just in the very tangible ways of taking care of your physical, emotional, and financial needs. Because if you actually take care of yourself, you feel guilty. Or if taking is difficult, because you're not getting that sort of heartfelt need satisfied and you don't really trust that process, you become kind of presumptive and you reach out and grab things and take things without regard for other people. And this can be very subtle. And it's kind of ironic that that's not a sign that you're too good at taking. It's a sign that you actually are not good at taking because you're not letting it into your heart. So you have to go out and grab everything that you can. When the taking quadrant is easy in your life, you trust that what you want matters. And you learn to acknowledge it and ask for it easily. And at the same time, you develop a very high regard for other people's limits. So that means you're not pushy and you're never presumptuous about what you get to have, but you take responsibility for wanting it and you ask for it with gentleness and clarity. And you create spaciousness for the other person to have whatever limits they have. And when taking is easy, you get good at self-care. You are aware of and tend to your emotional needs, your physical needs, your well-being, your health, your financial needs. And you do that in a way that works for you and is respectful of others. So there's a spiritual element in the taking quadrant, as there is with all of them. And that is that all spiritual paths have something to say about desire. They talk about it differently or define it differently, but all paths have something to say about desire. The taking quadrant makes you acknowledge and come face to face with the fact that you desire to do stuff. And so that practice of acknowledging that can be a spiritual path all its own. And that leads to integrity, acknowledging what's real for you instead of pretending that it's something else. And when you take full responsibility for it, of course, that frees you up. It also frees up the people around you who no longer have to guess. This sort of complete opposite to the taking role is passivity. There's nothing spiritual about being passive. And we'll talk about that a little more in the allowing quadrant. So the taking quadrant has a shadow too, of course, as they all do. And this is where the word taking, it gets a bad name. It's the co-opting, using, grabbing, stealing, just reaching out and taking something that you want without regard for the other person. And that, of course, is outside the circle of consent. And this is why, the shadow of it is why it can be often difficult to find the experience of the taking quadrant, because you stand there in the middle and you look out at this horrible stuff out there, and I'm not going anywhere in there. So that's why it can be kind of scary to even go in the taking quadrant. In exploring the taking quadrant, what I've come to see is that our entire culture is built on that shadow of the taking quadrant. Our ability to reach out and grab other people's land, oil fields, cheap labor, tungsten mines. We just have subtle and not so subtle ways of reaching out and taking whatever we want. And that's our culture is based on that. So even though we may abhor it, the shadow of taking, we're also, every one of us, complicit in our cultural pattern of taking. That can be hard to face. The irony of it, perhaps, is that when we have an actual physical, tangible, skin-to-skin, heartfelt experience of taking as a gift to us, it touches our heart and we come to clarity and peace with it so that we know its place, and then and that teaches us respect for the other person. And so that kind of taking and grabbing becomes just like unthinkable. So it's ironic perhaps that it's the experience of receiving the gift of taking that allows you not to have to go steal to get that need met. It's a very different experience. So perhaps we should open all meetings of Congress by playing the 3-minute game. That's a world vision for you. So that's the taking quadrant. I hope you have many years and lots of good times exploring it.